Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the controls of her A-10 Thunderbolt II as she flew low over the desert landscape of Iraq. The year was 2003, and the invasion was in full swing. Sarah was one of the few female pilots flying the legendary Warthog, a plane built around its massive 30mm cannon and designed to destroy enemy tanks and support ground troops. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sandy terrain below as Sarah's squadron approached their target area. Intelligence reports indicated enemy armored vehicles were threatening a convoy of American soldiers who had become separated from their main unit during the chaotic advance toward Baghdad. Time was running out. Sarah's radio crackled with the voice of her wing commander. "Hawkeye 2, we've got friendlies pinned down at grid reference 345789. Multiple enemy vehicles closing in from the north. You're cleared hot." "Roger, Hawkeye lead. I've got visual on the targets." Sarah could see the dust clouds kicked up by enemy tanks moving across the desert floor. Below them, she spotted the small group of American vehicles taking cover behind a rocky outcrop. Smoke was rising from one of the Humvees. Sarah rolled her aircraft into a steep dive, lining up her shot. The A-10's cannon was devastating against armored vehicles, capable of firing 4,200 rounds per minute of depleted uranium shells. But as she prepared to engage, something went wrong. A surface-to-air missile streaked up from a hidden position, its white contrail cutting through the blue sky like a deadly arrow. Sarah saw it coming and immediately began evasive maneuvers, pulling hard on the stick and releasing chaff and flares to confuse the missile's guidance system. The first missile missed, exploding harmlessly off her starboard wing. But there was a second one she hadn't seen. This one found its mark, slamming into the rear of her aircraft with tremendous force. The explosion shook the Warthog violently, and warning lights immediately began flashing across her instrument panel. "Mayday! Mayday! Hawkeye 2 taking heavy damage. I've lost hydraulics and my right engine is on fire." Sarah's voice remained calm despite the desperate situation. Her training had prepared her for this moment, though she had hoped it would never come. The A-10 was famous for being able to take punishment and keep flying, but Sarah could feel the aircraft becoming harder to control with each passing second. Smoke was filling the cockpit, and the smell of burning fuel and electronics made her eyes water. "Hawkeye 2, this is lead. Can you make it back to base?" Her commander's voice was tense with concern. Sarah checked her instruments and felt her heart sink. The damage was too severe. Oil pressure was dropping rapidly, and her remaining engine was overheating. The controls were becoming increasingly unresponsive. She was going down, and there was nothing she could do about it. "Negative, lead. I'm not going to make it. Preparing to eject." The ground below was hostile territory, crawling with enemy forces. Sarah knew that once she ejected, she would be completely vulnerable until rescue could arrive. But staying with the aircraft meant certain death. "Roger, Hawkeye 2. We'll get you out of there. Good luck." Sarah reached for the ejection handle between her legs. She had practiced this procedure countless times in training, but doing it for real was terrifying. Once she pulled that handle, there would be no going back. She took a deep breath and yanked the handle hard. The canopy exploded away from the aircraft, and a split second later, the ejection seat fired her up and out of the dying Warthog. The force was incredible, like being hit by a truck. Everything happened in slow motion as she watched her aircraft spiral down toward the desert floor. The parachute deployed with a sharp jerk, and suddenly Sarah was floating down through the quiet sky. Below her, she could see her A-10 impact the ground in a ball of fire and smoke. The aircraft that had been her home away from home for the past 2 years was gone. As she drifted down, Sarah could see enemy vehicles converging on her landing spot. She had maybe 10 minutes before she hit the ground, and then she would be on foot in hostile territory with nothing but her survival gear and sidearm. The situation looked hopeless, but what Sarah didn't know was that high above her, two F-16 Fighting Falcons had been monitoring the entire engagement. The pilots had watched her Warthog get hit and seen her eject. Now they were circling overhead, trying to figure out how to help their fellow airmen survive until rescue could arrive. Lieutenant Colonel Jake Viper Harrison was leading the F-16 flight. He had been in the Air Force for 15 years and had seen plenty of combat, but watching a fellow pilot get shot down never got easier. He immediately got on the radio to coordinate a rescue mission. Desert Control. This is Viper Flight. We have a pilot down in hostile territory, requesting immediate combat search and rescue. The response was not what he wanted to hear. Viper Flight, CSAR assets are engaged elsewhere. Earliest response time is 45 minutes. Jake looked down at the parachute descending toward the desert floor. 45 minutes might as well be 45 hours. The pilot would never survive that long on the ground with enemy forces closing in. Copy that, Desert Control. Viper Flight will maintain overwatch until rescue arrives. Jake's wingman, Captain Mike Torch Rodriguez, pulled up alongside him. What's the plan, boss? We can't just watch them capture one of our own. Jake was thinking the same thing, but their F-16s were loaded with air-to-air missiles, not the kind of weapons needed to effectively engage ground targets. They had some cannon rounds, but not enough to hold off an entire enemy unit for 45 minutes. As they watched, Sarah's parachute touched down in a small valley between two rocky ridges. She quickly gathered her chute and ran for cover behind some large boulders. The enemy vehicles were still several kilometers away, but they were moving fast. That's when Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. As he flew lower to get a better look at the crash site, he could clearly see the tail number on the burning wreckage of the A-10. It read 810992. Jake knew that number. He knew it because he had seen it painted on another aircraft years ago, during his time as an instructor pilot at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona. But that couldn't be right. The pilot he was thinking of was supposed to be flying transport missions, not close air support in Iraq. He grabbed his checklist and flipped to the back page where he kept personal notes and phone numbers. There it was, written in his own handwriting. Sarah Mitchell, A-10 student pilot, tail number 810992. Sarah Mitchell. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew exactly who was sitting in that valley, surrounded by enemy forces and running out of time. 3 years earlier, Jake had been Sarah's instructor when she was learning to fly the A-10 at Luke Air Force Base. She had been one of the best students he had ever trained. But more than that, she was the pilot who had saved his life during a training accident. It happened on a routine training flight over the Arizona desert. Jake had been flying chase in an F-16, while Sarah practiced low-level navigation in her A-10. Everything was going normally until Jake's engine suffered a catastrophic failure at low altitude. He had no choice but to eject, but his parachute became tangled in the rocky terrain of a desert canyon. Sarah had seen the whole thing happen. Instead of returning to base as protocol demanded, she had stayed on station and used her A-10's radio to coordinate his rescue. But more importantly, she had spotted a group of coyotes that were moving toward Jake's position. Using her aircraft's cannon, she had fired warning shots to keep the animals away until help could arrive. The rescue team later told Jake that if Sarah hadn't stayed and protected him, the coyotes would have attacked him while he was hanging helpless from his parachute lines. She had quite literally saved his life, and he had never forgotten it. Now she was the one who needed saving, and Jake was determined to return the favor. He got on the radio to his wingman. Torch, change of plans. We're not just providing overwatch. We're going to get our pilot out of there ourselves. How? We don't have the right weapons for close air support. Jake looked down at the enemy vehicles getting closer to Sarah's position. He was already formulating a plan, but it was going to be dangerous and would require split-second timing. We're going to use what we have. Follow my lead and stay close. We're going in low and fast. Sarah pressed herself against the rocky outcrop, trying to make herself as small as possible. The desert sun was already beating down mercilessly, and she could feel sweat dripping down her back inside her flight suit. Her survival radio crackled with static as she tried to make contact with friendly forces. Any station, this is Hawkeye 20 down in Sector 7. Request immediate extraction. She kept her voice low, knowing that enemy forces could be monitoring radio frequencies. The response came from above. Hawkeye 20, this is Viper Lead. We have you in sight and are maintaining overwatch. Help is on the way. Sarah looked up and could see two F-16s circling high overhead. The sight of friendly aircraft gave her some comfort, but she knew they couldn't do much to help her if enemy ground forces reached her position. F-16s were air superiority fighters, not close air support aircraft like her Warthog had been. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see dust clouds approaching from multiple directions. At least 4 enemy vehicles were converging on her location. Sarah checked her M9 pistol and the spare magazines on her survival vest. 15 rounds per magazine, 4 magazines total. Not much firepower against armored vehicles and infantry. High above, Jake Harrison was studying the tactical situation and didn't like what he saw. The enemy vehicles were moving in a coordinated pattern, clearly attempting to surround Sarah's position. Once they had her surrounded, the F-16s would be unable to provide effective support without risking hitting the downed pilot. Torch, we need to break up their formation before they can complete the encirclement. I'm going to make a gun run on the lead vehicle. You take the trail vehicle. Copy, Viper Lead. But we're only carrying 5.11 rounds each. That's not going to last long against multiple targets. Jake knew his wingman was right, but they had to try something. We'll make every shot count. Follow me in. The two F-16s rolled into steep dives, accelerating rapidly toward the desert floor. Jake selected his M61 Vulcan cannon and lined up on the lead enemy vehicle, a Soviet-made BMP infantry fighting vehicle. The 20mm cannon rounds might not destroy the vehicle, but they would certainly get the crew's attention. Sarah heard the distinctive whine of jet engines diving at high speed. She looked up to see the F-16s screaming down from above, their cannon muzzles already flashing. The lead enemy vehicle suddenly disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris as 20mm rounds impacted all around it. The BMP swerved violently and came to a stop, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. The second F-16 was already lining up on another target, its cannon spitting fire at the trailing vehicle in the enemy formation. But Jake's celebration was short-lived. As he pulled up from his gun run, he saw something that made his blood run cold. 2 more enemy vehicles had appeared from a hidden position in a wadi to the east. These weren't lightly armored BMPs, but actual main battle tanks. Their thick armor would be virtually immune to 20mm cannon fire. Viper Lead, we've got company. 2 T-55 tanks moving in from the east. Torch's voice was tense as he reported the new threat. Jake quickly assessed the situation. The F-16s had bought Sarah some time by stopping the initial assault, but now they faced a much more serious threat. The tank's main guns could easily destroy any rescue helicopter that tried to land, and their machine guns would make it impossible for Sarah to remain in her current position. Torch, we need to call in heavier support. Get on the horn to AWACS and see if they can vector in any Warthogs or B-1s. But even as Jake said it, he knew it would take too long. The tanks were already moving into position, and Sarah would be overrun long before help could arrive. Down on the ground, Sarah could see the new threat approaching. The distinctive silhouettes of the T-55 tanks were unmistakable, their main guns traversing as they searched for targets. She knew that her rocky cover would provide no protection against a 100mm tank shell. She keyed her radio again. Viper Lead, I've got 2 tanks moving in from the east. I need to relocate to a better position. Negative, Hawkeye 20, stay put. Moving now will expose you to their machine guns. Sarah understood the logic, but staying put felt like waiting to die. The tanks were less than a kilometer away now, and she could hear the rumble of their engines echoing off the rocky walls of the valley. That's when Jake made a decision that would either save Sarah's life or get all three of them killed. He had noticed a narrow canyon that led deeper into the rocky terrain to the west of Sarah's position. If she could reach it, the tanks wouldn't be able to follow, and their main guns wouldn't have a clear line of sight. But getting there would mean crossing 200 meters of open ground while under fire from both tanks and infantry. It seemed impossible, but Jake had an idea. Torch, I need you to make a low pass directly over those tanks. Make them button up and stop their advance. Roger, boss. But what about you? I'm going to provide cover for our pilot. Sarah, can you hear me? Sarah was surprised to hear the F-16 pilot use her first name. Military protocol called for using call signs during combat operations. Affirmative, Viper Lead. Listen carefully. There's a canyon about 200 meters to your west. When I give the word, I want you to run for it as fast as you can. Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Just run. Sarah looked west and could see the canyon entrance. It looked impossibly far away across the open desert floor. Roger, but those tanks will have a clear shot at me. Not if I can help it. Get ready. Jake rolled his F-16 into another steep dive, but this time he wasn't targeting the enemy vehicles. Instead, he was aiming for a spot directly between Sarah and the approaching tanks. His plan was insane, but it was the only chance they had. At 500 feet above the ground, Jake pulled the trigger on his cannon and held it down. Instead of short, controlled bursts, he was laying down a continuous stream of 20mm rounds, creating a wall of fire and flying debris between Sarah and her pursuers. Go, go, go! Jake shouted into his radio. Sarah didn't hesitate. She burst from cover and ran as hard as she had ever run in her life. Behind her, she could hear the roar of the F-16's cannon and the crack of bullets passing overhead as the enemy forces returned fire. The 200 meters felt like 200 miles. Sarah's flight boots weren't designed for running across rough desert terrain, and she stumbled twice, but managed to keep her footing. Bullets kicked up sand all around her as enemy soldiers tried to find their mark. Jake's cannon ran out of ammunition just as Sarah reached the canyon entrance. He pulled up hard, his F-16 climbing steeply away from the enemy fire that was now concentrating on him instead of the fleeing pilot. Sarah dove into the narrow canyon just as a tank shell exploded against the rocks where she had been running moments before. The concussion knocked her down, but she was alive and relatively safe. The canyon walls would protect her from direct fire, and the tanks couldn't follow her into the narrow passage. Hawkeye 2-0. Report status, Jake called as he climbed back to altitude. I'm okay. Good shooting, Viper Lead. That was some of the best cover fire I've ever seen. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. But the situation was far from resolved. Sarah was temporarily safe, but she was also trapped in the canyon with limited options for escape. The enemy forces would undoubtedly try to find another way to reach her, and the F-16s were now completely out of cannon ammunition. Torch, status report? I'm Winchester on guns too, boss, and I'm showing bingo fuel in 10 minutes. Jake checked his own fuel gauges and realized they had the same problem. The low-level maneuvering and high-speed gun runs had consumed fuel at an alarming rate. They would have to return to base soon or risk running out of fuel and becoming casualties themselves. But Jake wasn't ready to abandon Sarah. Not after what she had done for him 3 years ago, and not when he was so close to getting her out alive. Desert Control, this is Viper Lead. We need an immediate fuel tanker and weapons reload. Our pilot is still in hostile territory and under threat. Viper Lead, nearest tanker is 40 minutes out. You need to return to base for refuel and rearm. 40 minutes. Jake knew Sarah didn't have that long. The enemy would find a way to reach her position long before then. He was about to respond when Torch's voice cut across the radio. Viper Lead, I've got multiple aircraft inbound from the south. Looks like a full package. Jake looked toward the southern horizon and saw them too. 4 aircraft flying in tight formation, moving fast and low. As they got closer, Jake could make out their distinctive shapes and felt his spirits soar. Hawkeye 2-0, help has arrived. 4 A-10s inbound, ETA 2 minutes. The cavalry was coming, and it was flying the same type of aircraft Sarah had been shot down in. The Warthogs were loaded for ground attack, with Maverick missiles, cluster bombs, and thousands of rounds of 30mm ammunition. The enemy tanks and infantry that had seemed so threatening moments before were about to face the full fury of the Air Force's premier close air support aircraft. But as the A-10s approached, Jake realized that this rescue was about to become something much bigger than he had anticipated. The enemy forces in the area were larger than initially reported, and what had started as a simple pilot rescue was turning into a major engagement. Sarah, huddled in her rocky canyon, heard the distinctive sound of A-10 engines approaching and knew that her ordeal was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. The 4 A-10 Thunderbolts approached the battlefield like avenging angels, their twin engines growling with barely contained power. Leading the formation was Major Lisa Crusher Williams, a veteran pilot with over 200 combat missions under her belt. When she had received the call that a fellow Warthog pilot was down, she had immediately volunteered to lead the rescue mission. Viper Lead, this is Crusher Flight. We're ready to light up anything that moves down there. Give us a target brief. Jake quickly updated the A-10 pilots on the tactical situation. 2 tanks were still operational and moving to flank Sarah's position, while dismounted infantry was attempting to find a route into the canyon where she was hiding. Additional enemy reinforcements were reportedly moving in from the north. Crusher Flight, priority targets are the 2 T-55s at grid 345792. Secondary targets are the infantry positions around the canyon entrance. Be advised, our pilot is located in the canyon at 345788. Copy, Viper Lead. We've got good visual on the targets. Beginning our attack run now. Major Williams rolled her A-10 into a shallow dive, lining up on the lead tank. The 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted in the nose of her aircraft was specifically designed to destroy armored vehicles like the T-55s below. Each depleted uranium round could penetrate several inches of steel armor. The distinctive brr-t sound of the A-10's cannon echoed across the desert as Williams fired a 3-second burst at the lead tank. The massive shells tore through the T-55's armor like paper, igniting the fuel and ammunition stored inside. The tank exploded in a brilliant fireball that could be seen for miles. The second A-10 was already lining up on the remaining tank, which was desperately trying to maneuver into a defensive position. But the T-55 was no match for the Warthog's speed and firepower. Another burst from the 30mm cannon, and the second tank joined the first as a smoking ruin on the desert floor. From her position in the canyon, Sarah could hear the sounds of battle raging outside, the deep rumble of the A-10's engines mixed with the crack of explosions and the chatter of automatic weapons fire. She wanted desperately to see what was happening, but she knew that showing herself would only create problems for the pilots trying to rescue her. Her survival radio crackled again. Hawkeye 2-0, this is Crusher Lead. We've neutralized the armor threat. Stand by while we clean up the infantry. The remaining A-10s made several passes over the area, using their cannons to suppress the enemy soldiers who were trying to reach Sarah's position. The combination of 30mm rounds and the psychological effect of the Warthog's presence was devastating to enemy morale. Within minutes, the surviving enemy forces were retreating northward. All enemy forces in the immediate area have been neutralized, Major Williams reported. The landing zone is clear for CS Air. Jake, who had been orbiting overhead and coordinating the attack, finally allowed himself to relax. The immediate threat to Sarah was over, but they still needed to get her out of hostile territory before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Desert Control, this is Viper Lead. Request immediate CSR for downed pilot. LZ is secure. Roger. Viper Lead, Pedro 23 is inbound. ETA 15 minutes. Pedro 23 was the call sign for an HH-60G Pavehawk rescue helicopter, specially equipped and trained for combat search and rescue missions. The helicopter crew had been standing by at a forward operating base, waiting for the all-clear to begin the rescue operation. While they waited for the helicopter to arrive, Jake decided it was time to make contact with Sarah directly. He had been thinking about their past connection throughout the entire engagement, and he wanted her to know who had been coordinating her rescue. Hawkeye 20, this is Viper Lead. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention? Negative on the injuries, Viper Lead. I'm good to go. Thanks for the assist up there. That was some pretty impressive flying. Jake took a deep breath before his next transmission. Sarah, this is Jake Harrison. Do you remember me from Luke Air Force Base? There was a long pause on the radio. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to place the name and voice. Then it hit her like a thunderbolt. Jake Harrison had been her instructor pilot during A-10 training 3 years ago. He was the F-16 pilot whose life she had saved when his aircraft went down during a training mission. Jake, is that really you up there? It's me, Sarah. I recognized your tail number when your aircraft went down. I couldn't let anything happen to the pilot who saved my life. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. The emotion of the moment was overwhelming. Here she was, sitting in a rocky canyon in the middle of Iraq, talking to someone who had been both her teacher and someone whose life she had saved years ago. Now he had returned the favor. I can't believe it's you, she managed to say. What are the odds? Pretty slim, I'd say, but I'm glad I was here when you needed help. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of rotor blades approaching. The HH-60G Pavehawk was making its approach to the landing zone that the A-10s had cleared of enemy forces. The helicopter was escorted by 2 AH-64 Apache attack helicopters, providing additional security for the rescue operation. Pedro 23 is on approach, the rescue helicopter pilot announced. Survivor, pop smoke to mark your position. Sarah pulled a smoke grenade from her survival vest and activated it. Orange smoke began billowing from the canyon entrance, clearly marking her location for the incoming helicopter. The Pavehawk settled down in a cloud of dust just outside the canyon entrance. 2 pararescue specialists, known as PJs, immediately jumped out and ran toward Sarah's position. These highly trained medics and combat specialists were among the most elite soldiers in the Air Force, capable of providing medical care and tactical support in the most dangerous situations. Ma'am, we're here to get you out, one of the PJs said as he reached Sarah's position. Are you hurt? Can you walk? I'm fine. Let's get out of here before more bad guys show up. The PJs quickly escorted Sarah to the waiting helicopter. As she climbed aboard, she looked up and could see the F-16s and A-10s still circling overhead, providing protection for the rescue operation. She thought about Jake up there in his F-16, watching over her just as she had watched over him years ago. The helicopter lifted off and began its flight back to friendly territory. As they gained altitude, Sarah could see the smoking wreckage of her A-10 in the distance. The sight filled her with sadness, but she was alive and free thanks to the courage and skill of her fellow pilots. Pedro 23, this is Viper Lead. Package is secure. Request permission to escort you home. Roger. Viper Lead. Escort is appreciated. The flight back to base was uneventful, but Sarah's mind was racing with thoughts about what had just happened. The odds of Jake being in the right place at the right time to coordinate her rescue seemed astronomical. Yet here they were, proof that sometimes fate works in mysterious ways. When they landed at the forward operating base, Sarah was immediately taken to the medical facility for a routine post-ejection examination. She was physically unharmed, but the flight surgeons wanted to make sure she hadn't suffered any injuries from the ejection or her time on the ground. While she was being examined, Jake and his wingman landed at the same base to refuel and rearm their aircraft. Jake hurried to the medical facility, wanting to see Sarah in person and make sure she was truly okay. When he walked into the examination room, Sarah looked up and smiled. It was the first time they had seen each other face to face since her graduation from A-10 training 3 years ago. "You look good for someone who just got shot down," Jake said with a grin. "You look good for someone who's old enough to be my instructor," Sarah replied, laughing. They hugged, both of them overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. Two Air Force pilots who had saved each other's lives, brought together again by the random chances of war. "I never got to properly thank you for what you did that day in Arizona," Jake said. "If you hadn't stayed and kept those coyotes away, I might not be here today. And if you hadn't recognized my tail number and decided to do something about it, I definitely wouldn't be here today," Sarah replied. "I'd say we're even." The flight surgeon finished his examination and declared Sarah fit for duty. Her commanding officer, who had flown in from the main air base, was waiting to debrief her on the mission and the circumstances of her aircraft being shot down. "Captain Mitchell," the colonel said, "I understand you were providing close air support when your aircraft was hit. Can you walk me through what happened?" Sarah gave a detailed account of the mission, from the initial target briefing to the moment she ejected from her damaged aircraft. The colonel listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. "The ground unit you were supporting has reported that your attack destroyed 3 enemy vehicles before you were hit," the colonel said. "Your actions may have saved the lives of an entire squad of American soldiers." Sarah felt a sense of pride at the news, but it was tempered by the loss of her aircraft. The A-10 had been her home in the sky for 2 years, and watching it burn on the desert floor had been painful. "Sir, when will I be able to get back in the air?" she asked. "Well, that depends on a few things. First, we need to complete the investigation into the shoot-down to see if there were any procedural issues. Second, we need to find you another aircraft to fly. A-10s aren't exactly growing on trees out here." Jake, who had been listening to the conversation, spoke up. "Sir, if I may make a suggestion, Captain Mitchell is one of the finest pilots I've ever trained. The Air Force needs pilots like her in the air, not sitting behind a desk." The colonel looked at Jake with interest. "And you are?" "Lieutenant Colonel Jake Harrison, sir. I was Captain Mitchell's instructor pilot during her initial A-10 training. I was also the mission commander who coordinated her rescue today." "I see. Well, Lieutenant Colonel, I appreciate your assessment. Captain Mitchell will be back in the air soon enough, assuming she passes her requalification requirements." Over the following weeks, Sarah went through the process of being cleared to return to combat operations. The investigation into her shoot-down concluded that she had followed all proper procedures and that the loss of her aircraft was due to effective enemy air defenses, not pilot error. Jake returned to his regular duties with his F-16 squadron, but he stayed in touch with Sarah through email and occasional phone calls. Their shared experience had created a bond that transcended the normal relationships between Air Force pilots. 3 months later, Sarah was back in the cockpit of a new A-10, flying close air support missions over Iraq. She had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions on the day she was shot down, and her rescue had become something of a legend within the Air Force community. The story of how an F-16 pilot recognized the tail number of a downed A-10 and orchestrated a daring rescue spread throughout the military. It became a testament to the bonds that exist between American service members and the lengths they will go to protect one another. Years later, when both Jake and Sarah had returned to the United States and resumed their peacetime careers, they would often reflect on that day in the Iraqi desert. It had been a day that demonstrated the very best of military service: courage, skill, dedication, and above all, the willingness to risk everything to save a fellow warrior. The war in Iraq would eventually end, and both pilots would go on to have distinguished careers in the Air Force. But neither would ever forget the day when fate brought them together again in the skies over a hostile desert. proving that sometimes the bonds forged in service are strong enough to overcome any obstacle.